It started like any other day. Airports were busy, people were rushing, announcements were echoing, and thousands of passengers were ready to travel across India. No one knew that something unusual was about to happen. Something that would shake the entire aviation system of the country. Something that would make the busiest airline in India come to a sudden stop. In just a few hours, confusion spread like wildfire. At first, it looked like a small delay, a single flight postponed, a couple of gates showing, rescheduled, a few passengers standing and checking their boarding passes again and again. But within minutes, that small delay turned into something much bigger. Screens across airports began to turn red. Delayed. Cancelled. Delayed. Cancelled. Passengers started calling family members. Some called offices. Some tried to find Indigo staff for answers. No one expected what was coming next. 300 flights cancelled in just 48 hours. Imagine this. You arrive at the airport with your luggage. You have a meeting to attend, a wedding to reach, an exam to give, a job interview waiting. And suddenly you see your flight is not just late, it is cancelled. People around you are panicking. Lines are getting longer. The air smells of stress, worry, and frustration. You ask the airline staff, what is happening? But even they look confused. Because this was not a normal day. This was a meltdown. At major airports, Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, crowds started forming near Indigo counters. Long queues curled around the terminals. Passengers demanded answers. Some shouted. Some cried. Some begged for any alternate flight. But the truth was simple. There were no alternate flights. At least not enough. Within a short time, airports became emotional pressure points. Children were sitting on the floor, tired and confused. Elderly passengers were looking for wheelchairs and support. Foreign tourists stood at counters with puzzled faces, trying to understand why no one could explain why so many flights were cancelled at the same time. This was a crisis that India had not seen in years. Airlines do get delays. Airlines do face technical issues. Weather sometimes disrupts flights. But 300 flights cancelled in 48 hours? That is not normal. That is not random. That is not a coincidence. Something bigger was wrong. And the biggest question was, why? Inside Indigo's operations room, phones were ringing non-stop. Flight schedules were collapsing. Crew assignments were not matching. Pilots were ready, planes were ready, passengers were ready, but something was missing. Something critical. Crew. Cabin crew. Suddenly, a large number of cabin crew members had taken sick leave. Not 1 or 2. Not 20. Not 50. Hundreds. In just a few hours, the airline didn't have enough crew to run flights. And without crew, planes cannot fly. Not even if the pilot is ready. Not even if the aircraft is perfect. Not even if thousands of passengers are waiting. A single missing roll can stop a giant airline. As passengers waited at airports, as counters got overwhelmed, as social media exploded with angry comments, inside Indigo, the system was falling apart. Cancel one flight, the crew for the next flight gets delayed. Delay another flight, then the connecting flight gets affected. The system works like a chain, and once the chain breaks, everything collapses. Many people didn't understand why staff shortage matters so much. But in aviation, the rules are strict. Cabin crew cannot work beyond a certain number of hours. They must follow rest rules. They must follow safety guidelines. If they are not present, the flight cannot operate. Passengers saw cancellations. But behind the scenes, Indigo saw something else, an operational earthquake. Nobody knew whether the crew really fell sick, or whether something bigger was happening. Frustration, pressure, silent protest. People started asking, can so many employees fall sick at the same moment? But those answers would only come later. Right now, the meltdown was growing. In the first few hours, Around 30 to 40 flights were cancelled. Then 70. Then 120. Then 200. By the end of 2 days, almost 300 flights were gone from the skies. One airline, thousands of passengers, and a crisis that felt like watching a giant collapse in slow motion. Families were stuck at airports overnight. Newborn babies were crying because there was no food or milk available. People with medical conditions were stressed. International passengers missed connecting flights. Students missed exams. Employees missed interviews. Some weddings went on without key family members because flights simply didn't take off. And Indigo, India's largest airline, suddenly looked helpless. The government had to step in. The DGCA, India's aviation regulator, asked for immediate reports. They demanded explanations. They wanted to know how the biggest airline in the country failed so badly in such a short time. They wanted to know why there was no backup plan. They wanted to know why Indigo let things reach this breaking point. As people were sleeping on airport floors, as customer care lines were overflowing, as media started reporting nationwide aviation chaos, the truth was becoming clear. This was not just a simple disruption. This was a warning sign for India's aviation system. If the largest airline can collapse in 48 hours, what does it mean for the future? What does it say about the pressure on crew? What does it say about the workload? What does it say about management decisions? What does it say about safety rules? What does it say about the system itself? Passengers looked at the screens. Officials looked at data. Airlines looked at schedules. But the real story was unfolding behind the scenes. A story of pressure, fatigue, miscommunication, and a chain reaction that nobody could stop once it began. And yet, the biggest question remained. How did it all start? Why did this happen now? And what exactly was going on inside Indigo? The meltdown had only begun. The truth was much deeper. And to understand that truth, we must go inside the reason, the hidden problem that triggered the entire crisis. That is where the real story begins. Part 2. The real reason behind the crisis. To understand the Indigo meltdown, we have to look deeper. Because the real reason was not visible to passengers standing in queues. It was not visible to people checking their cancelled flights on their phones. It was not visible to frustrated families sleeping on airport floors. The real reason was hidden inside the airline. When hundreds of cabin crew members suddenly took sick leave, the question everyone started asking was simple. How can so many people fall sick together? Airlines know that 1 or 2 members might take leave. That is normal. But when a large group takes leave at the same time, something is wrong. Something big is happening behind the scenes. Something that passengers never get to see. What is that something? Pressure. Fatigue. Exhaustion. For months, cabin crew members had been complaining quietly. Long duty hours. Tight schedules. Back-to-back flights. Growing passenger numbers. Continuous delays. Changing rules. Increasing workload. And very little rest. Being cabin crew may look glamorous from the outside. Smiling faces, neat uniforms, friendly announcements. But inside, it is one of the toughest jobs. They work odd hours. They are constantly in the air. Their bodies are tired. Their voices get strained. They barely sleep. And the responsibility is huge. Your life depends on them during emergencies. But many felt they were reaching their breaking point. Some crew members believed scheduling had become extremely tight. Some felt overworked. Some felt unheard. Some felt management was not listening. And when people feel exhausted and unheard for too long, something eventually snaps. And this time, it snapped suddenly. Reports came in that a large section of Indigo cabin crew took sick leave because they were unhappy with the new work rules. The timing of the sick leave looked coordinated. It looked like a silent protest, the kind that cannot be announced openly, but can shake an entire company. Think about it. A small group of people can hold a sign and protest outside an office. But when hundreds of essential employees stop working at the same time, the entire system collapses. Inside Indigo, the impact was immediate. The crew responsible for morning flights suddenly didn't show up. That created the first wave of cancellations. Because of that, the flights planned for later in the day couldn't be prepared on time. And those delays hit the next flights. And then the next. And then the next. Aviation runs on perfect timing. If one piece fails, the whole machine stops. Pilots were ready. Aircraft were ready. Airports were ready. Passengers were ready. But without cabin crew, the aircraft doors could not be closed. Without cabin crew, safety checks could not be done. Without cabin crew, flights simply could not move. For the first few hours, passengers were told, "Please wait, there is a small delay." But inside the operation rooms, people already knew this wasn't a small problem. It wasn't one flight. It wasn't even 10 flights. This was a system breakdown. By afternoon, the news spread across airports. There is a crew shortage. Videos appeared online of angry passengers demanding answers. Someone was crying because their father was in the hospital, and they had to reach urgently. Someone missed a visa appointment. Someone missed their international connection. Someone spent the whole night at the airport floor with their children. And still, the meltdown continued. Many people started asking online, why can't Indigo call other crew to replace them? Where is the backup plan? Why is India's largest airline not prepared? But the truth is, there is never enough backup for a crisis this big. You cannot suddenly produce hundreds of trained crew members. You cannot magically bring people from other cities. You cannot break duty time rules. Once the chain breaks, even the biggest airline becomes helpless. Aviation experts started questioning Indigo's planning. Some said the airline had been running extremely tight schedules for a long time. Some said fatigue was ignored. Some said the new rules introduced by the regulator had made work more demanding. Some said the crew had been complaining for months. But what made this situation worse was timing. This happened during busy travel days. This happened during peak hours. This happened when airports were already crowded. This happened when passengers could not easily switch airlines. A perfect storm. For passengers, it was simple. My flight is cancelled. What do I do now? For crew, it was emotional. How long can we work like this? For Indigo, it was terrifying. What if this gets worse? For DGCA, it was serious. Why did this happen under our watch? And slowly, the story became bigger than just an airline crisis. It became a national issue. It became a question of safety. It became a question of management. It became a question of employee rights. It became a question of regulatory decisions. Because the meltdown revealed something very important. When people feel pressured and unheard. When communication breaks inside an organization. When rules become too strict without considering human limits. When scheduling becomes too tight. Then disruption is not just possible. It is guaranteed. Passengers saw long queues. Airports saw chaos. News channels saw a headline. But the real story, the real cause, was happening behind closed doors. And yet, the story wasn't over. Because when the crisis grew out of control, when passengers started protesting, when social media exploded, when airports became overcrowded, when Indigo could not explain what was happening. There was only one authority that could step in. Only one organization that had the power to control the situation. The DGCA. What they did next changed the entire story. And it shocked the aviation industry. Part 3. DGCA steps in. As the chaos continued, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or DGCA, had no choice but to act. This was no ordinary delay. This was a meltdown affecting thousands of passengers, hundreds of flights, and one of India's largest airlines. The regulator knew that if it didn't intervene quickly, the situation could get even worse, and public trust in aviation could collapse. DGCA officials immediately demanded a detailed report from Indigo. They wanted to know exactly why flights were being cancelled at such an unprecedented scale. They asked for crew rosters, sick leave records, operational plans, and explanations for why the airline's backup measures failed. They needed answers fast. At the same time, the DGCA sent officials to major airports, Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Hyderabad, to monitor operations firsthand. They observed passengers waiting in long lines, frustrated staff trying to manage the chaos, and a growing number of cancelled flights. Their presence alone signaled the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer just an airline problem. It was a national aviation crisis. One of the most important actions the DGCA took was to roll back new rules that had recently been introduced to manage airline operations. These rules, which were meant to make scheduling more efficient and flexible, had inadvertently added pressure to the staff. Cabin crew members were expected to adjust to stricter duty limits, more flights per day, and tighter reporting schedules. For months, airlines were struggling to comply. The sudden enforcement of these rules coincided with staff unrest, and the timing could not have been worse. By rolling back the rules temporarily, the DGCA gave airlines some breathing room. This allowed Indigo to reorganize its crew schedules and resume operations, but the situation was still fragile. Even with these measures, the airline could not immediately recover from the backlog of cancelled flights. Passengers were still stranded, airports were still crowded, and social media was buzzing with outrage. The DGCA also demanded that Indigo submit a root cause analysis. They wanted to know why a single department's disruption could trigger a chain reaction affecting hundreds of flights. The airline was asked to propose long-term solutions to prevent a similar crisis in the future. Every detail mattered: staffing patterns, shift planning, duty hours, communication channels, and even how contingency plans were implemented. Meanwhile, media outlets were covering the story relentlessly. The narrative was simple: Indigo, India's largest airline, had failed its passengers. Headlines screamed about chaos, frustration, and delays. Some experts criticized the airline's management. Others blamed regulatory policies. And passengers shared first-hand experiences of being stuck at airports overnight, missing important events, or even paying extra for alternative travel arrangements. In the middle of this chaos, DGCA officials reminded the public and the airlines that safety was paramount. No flight could be operated if the crew was fatigued or insufficient in number. The regulator emphasized that while inconvenience to passengers was regrettable, safety rules could not be compromised under any circumstances. This was an important message, a reminder that behind every flight, there is a complex system designed to protect human lives. As the DGCA probe unfolded, it revealed another crucial detail. Indigo's staff shortage was compounded by scheduling practices that left little margin for emergencies. Flights were tightly packed, duty hours were stretched, and crew members had minimal time to rest between assignments. Any small disruption, whether due to sickness, operational delay, or technical issues, could spiral into a massive crisis. And that's exactly what happened. The regulatory intervention marked a turning point. By rolling back rules, demanding explanations, and closely monitoring operations, The DGCA not only helped stabilize Indigo's flights, but also signaled to other airlines that proper planning and employee welfare were critical. Airlines across the country began reviewing their staffing policies and schedules. The message was clear: passenger convenience is important, but it must never come at the cost of safety and well-being of crew members. While the DGCA worked behind the scenes, passengers were still feeling the impact. Many were rebooking flights, trying alternative airlines, or rearranging their travel plans. Some were angry, some were stressed, and some were simply helpless. But the regulator's presence and firm action offered a sense of accountability. It reassured the public that someone was taking responsibility for what had gone wrong. What made this crisis particularly striking was how quickly it unfolded and how interconnected the system was. A single factor, crew shortage, triggered cascading cancellations across multiple airports and cities. DGCA's intervention helped stop the slide, but it also highlighted systemic weaknesses in airline operations. Even for one of the largest and most successful airlines, a lack of backup, combined with regulatory pressure and staff fatigue, could bring the entire network to a halt. Experts analyzing the situation noted that this was not just about Indigo. It was a wake-up call for India's aviation sector. Airlines had to strike a balance between operational efficiency, regulatory compliance, and human resource management. Employees' well-being could no longer be overlooked. Contingency plans had to be robust. Communication channels had to be clear. And regulators needed to be proactive, not just reactive. By the end of the intervention, the DGCA had achieved several key goals. It ensured that flights could resume safely. It temporarily eased rules that added pressure to staff. It demanded accountability from the airline's management. It sent a clear signal to all airlines about the importance of staff welfare and operational readiness. Yet, even with these measures, the human cost was evident. Stranded passengers, frustrated families, and employees under stress reminded everyone that airline operations are more than numbers on a schedule. They are about people, both those who fly and those who make the flights possible. And this is where the story of Indigo becomes more than just numbers. It becomes a story about human endurance, responsibility, and the complex chain of events that can turn a normal day into a crisis. It's a story that teaches lessons not just about aviation, but about planning, communication, and leadership under pressure. As airports slowly stabilized, as flights resumed, and as passengers began reaching their destinations, one truth remained: this meltdown exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. For the DGCA, it was a reminder that regulation is only effective if it accounts for human limits. For Indigo, it was a wake-up call to rethink scheduling, staffing, and communication. And for passengers, it was a harsh reminder of how fragile airline operations can be, even in one of the world's largest aviation markets. The question everyone would soon ask was simple but crucial: could this have been avoided? Was there a way to prevent hundreds of flights from being cancelled in just 48 hours? And most importantly, what would Indigo and the regulator do to ensure it never happened again? The answers were about to unfold. And when they did, the aviation world would watch closely. Part 4. Passenger Impact. What 300 cancelled flights means. While the DGCA was stepping in, passengers were living a very different reality. Screens at airports flashed red. Cancelled. Lines stretched endlessly at Indigo counters. Families, students, business travelers, and elderly passengers were all caught in a nightmare that felt impossible to escape. And the numbers were staggering. 300 flights cancelled in just 48 hours. Imagine arriving at the airport early in the morning, full of excitement and hope, only to find your flight has been cancelled. The announcement comes suddenly. People look at the screens, check their phones, and panic slowly sets in. There are children crying, grandparents struggling with luggage, and young professionals pacing nervously. For many, The journey they had planned meticulously now feels like chaos. People start calling customer care. Lines are busy. Phones keep ringing. Emails go unanswered. Some passengers don't know what to do. They try to find alternative flights, but discover that every nearby flight is either full or delayed. And the frustration only grows when staff, overwhelmed themselves, cannot provide clear answers. The feeling of helplessness is palpable. Airports become crowded very quickly. Every cancelled flight sends waves of passengers into waiting areas, lounges, and gate zones. Families with small children find themselves sitting on floors because seating is limited. Elderly travelers struggle to find assistance. People with urgent medical needs grow anxious. Some travelers miss connecting flights for international travel, throwing their plans completely off track. Exams are missed, interviews are delayed, weddings are unattended, business meetings are postponed. Life stops for thousands, all at once. Social media erupts. Passengers post videos and pictures of airport chaos, crowded check-in counters, angry crowds, crying children, frustrated staff. Hashtags trend instantly. Hush Indigo cancelled. Hush flight chaos. Hush airline meltdown. Some videos go viral, exposing the scale of the problem. For many viewers, the images are shocking. How could a single airline collapse affect so many lives? The airline promised compensation, but rules were confusing and not easy to claim. Many passengers felt that financial compensation could never replace the time and stress they lost. The emotional cost of being stranded far from home, stuck in crowded terminals, was immense. And yet, amidst the frustration, some passengers tried to remain calm. They helped others, shared food, guided those lost in the crowd. Human kindness shone even in chaos. Even businesses felt the impact. Hotels suddenly received last-minute bookings, taxis and rideshare services were overwhelmed, and airport shops struggled to meet unexpected demand. It wasn't just the passengers and the airline. The entire airport ecosystem experienced shockwaves. The ripple effect of 300 cancelled flights stretched far beyond just those waiting at the gate. Students trying to reach exams were among the hardest hit. Some missed crucial tests. Parents were stressed beyond measure, trying to find last-minute solutions. Business professionals watched meetings vanish into thin air, losing both time and opportunity. People with medical emergencies faced critical delays, and some international travelers had to rearrange flights that were booked months in advance. Every cancellation created a domino effect. In the midst of all this, people began questioning the airline's planning. How could such a large airline fail on this scale? Why were there no backup flights? Why wasn't communication better? Passengers demanded answers, on counters, on calls, on social media. And Indigo, despite its size and reputation, was struggling to respond. But the chaos was not just physical. It was emotional. The stress of waiting, the uncertainty of travel, and the feeling of powerlessness created tension everywhere. Families argued quietly. Children clung to parents. Adults paced terminals. The noise, the confusion, the endless announcements. It was sensory overload. For many, it was exhausting, frightening, and completely unexpected. Some passengers shared stories that touched hearts. One elderly couple, traveling to see their granddaughter for the first time, waited hours only to be told their flight was cancelled. They were offered a hotel for the night, but had to navigate an airport they barely knew. A student traveling to an entrance exam waited for hours in a crowded terminal, hoping for any flight that could take them to the exam city. Parents of young children were forced to improvise meals and comfort for their little ones, while waiting endlessly for updates. And all of this was happening while the airline and regulator tried to stabilize the situation. Crew were returning gradually. Flights were slowly resuming. Screens started changing from cancelled to delayed. But the backlog of thousands of passengers could not be cleared immediately. People were rebooking flights days in advance. Airports were still crowded. The chaos had left a mark. The media coverage was relentless. News anchors reported live from terminals. Journalists interviewed frustrated passengers. Analysts discussed the operational failures and human costs. Social media amplified every story, every complaint, every photograph. The public was paying attention, and the pressure on Indigo and regulators was enormous. And yet, even amid all the anger and frustration, the crisis revealed something important: how interconnected airline operations are, and how the actions of a single department, a few decisions, or a sudden staff shortage can ripple through the entire system. Every cancelled flight affected hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. The emotional toll was enormous, and the financial impact for passengers and airlines alike was massive. But it wasn't just numbers and chaos. It was real human stories. People stuck, people waiting, people struggling. That is why this crisis captured national attention. Because when 300 flights are cancelled, it's not just an operational failure. It's a human story, a lesson in planning, and a wake-up call for airlines, regulators, and passengers alike. And while passengers were experiencing this chaos, the airline and DGCA were working behind the scenes to understand the root cause, stabilize operations, and ensure flights could resume safely. But the question remained: how could such a meltdown happen so quickly? And what lessons would India's aviation industry learn from this massive disruption? What came next would reveal not only the internal struggles at Indigo, but also the vulnerabilities of the system that allowed such a massive passenger impact to happen in just 48 hours. Part 5. Inside Indigo. What went wrong internally? While passengers waited anxiously at airports, inside Indigo, a storm of a different kind was raging. Screens lit up with cancelled flights. Operations teams scrambled to reschedule, reassign crew, and manage the chaos. But behind the scenes, it wasn't just about delays. It was about a system that had been pushed to its limits for months, even years. Scheduling at Indigo is a complex puzzle. Hundreds of flights every day, thousands of passengers, multiple airports, and strict safety rules. Every crew member's shift must comply with regulations, rest hours must be respected, and every aircraft must be ready on time. On a normal day, this puzzle is already challenging. But during this crisis, it became almost impossible. One of the biggest problems was crew fatigue. Cabin crew had been working long hours with minimal breaks. Back-to-back flights, night schedules, early morning departures, and constant travel without sufficient rest had left many exhausted. Employees had complained quietly for months, but the volume of work continued to grow. The airline had been running at near full capacity, pushing both pilots and crew to their limits. When hundreds of staff suddenly reported sick, the fragile system crumbled. Flights that had been scheduled perfectly could no longer take off. Assigning replacement crew became a logistical nightmare. And because flights are interconnected, a delay in one city affected dozens of other flights across the country. The ripple effect was unstoppable. Management had to make decisions under extreme pressure. They had to balance safety, regulations, passenger satisfaction, and operational feasibility. But every choice had consequences. Calling in replacement crew meant violating rest rules. Delaying flights further frustrated passengers. Cancelling flights angered customers and attracted media attention. It was a lose-lose situation, and every decision was criticized. Communication also failed in critical moments. Passengers often received conflicting information. Some were told flights were delayed, only to learn later that they were cancelled. Staff at airport counters struggled to provide accurate updates. Even internal communication among Indigo departments wasn't smooth. Flight operations, crew management, and customer service were all trying to catch up, but the overload created confusion. Another internal factor was the pressure of new regulatory rules. DGCA had recently implemented changes meant to improve efficiency and safety. While well-intentioned, these rules added complexity to scheduling. Crew had less flexibility, and the airline had to strictly follow duty limits. In normal circumstances, this is manageable. But during the sudden staff shortage, it became a major obstacle. Management had to navigate these rules carefully. Any violation could result in penalties, but following them strictly meant more cancellations. Technology, which usually helps, couldn't completely prevent the crisis. Systems track crew assignments, flights, and passenger information. But no system can fully anticipate a sudden mass absence of employees. When hundreds of people called in sick simultaneously, algorithms and planning software couldn't provide instant solutions. Human oversight, judgment, and improvisation were required, and under pressure, mistakes were inevitable. The internal stress also affected morale. Staff members who were working under extreme pressure felt anxious and overwhelmed. They were managing upset passengers, rescheduling flights, and trying to keep operations afloat. The mental toll on employees cannot be underestimated. When human beings are stretched to their limits, small errors become unavoidable. This was not just a technical failure, it was a human one too. Indigo's leadership realized quickly that communication with passengers and the public was equally important. Official statements were released explaining delays, apologizing for inconvenience, and highlighting that safety could not be compromised. Social media teams responded to messages, and news outlets covered statements from the airline. But even well-crafted messages couldn't erase the frustration of thousands of stranded travelers. Analysts later pointed out that the meltdown exposed systemic vulnerabilities in Indigo's operations. Tight schedules, high flight density, minimal slack in crew planning, and reliance on strict rules created an environment where even a small disruption could cascade into a national crisis. And when employees are overworked and under pressure, the risk of sudden staff shortages increases. The lesson inside Indigo was clear. Operations cannot be sustainable without considering the human element. Planning flights, assigning crew, and managing schedules is not just a technical challenge, it is a human challenge. People are at the center of every flight, and their well-being directly affects the reliability of the airline. Meanwhile, passengers were still waiting. Delays continued for hours, and cancellations stretched over 2 full days. The internal problems at Indigo translated directly into passenger frustration, media criticism, and regulatory scrutiny. What happened inside the airline was no longer private, it was public, and it affected millions of people indirectly. Even simple tasks became monumental. Assigning crew for a single flight required cross-checking dozens of regulations, employee availability, and aircraft readiness. Delays in one city meant rescheduling in another. Flights to major hubs like Delhi, Mumbai, and Bengaluru were hardest hit. And each small delay snowballed into a major operational challenge. Through it all, the airline tried to maintain professionalism. Staff members worked tirelessly, often going beyond their limits. Management made difficult decisions to ensure safety. The DGCA monitored compliance, and passengers slowly began to see flights resume. But the internal breakdown highlighted something critical. Even the largest airline is vulnerable when operational systems are pushed too far without adequate human support. By the end of the crisis, the key factors inside Indigo were clear. Tight scheduling and high flight density increased operational risk. Crew fatigue and pressure created vulnerability. Communication failures amplified the crisis. Regulatory changes added complexity during an already stressed period. The system was not prepared for sudden mass absence of employees. And the question everyone began asking was inevitable. Could this have been prevented? Could better planning, better staffing, and better communication have avoided hundreds of cancelled flights and frustrated passengers? Could Indigo have designed a system that balances efficiency, safety, and human well-being? The answer would shape the future of airline operations in India. Lessons learned from this crisis were not just for Indigo, but for every airline, every airport, and every regulatory authority. Because the human and operational vulnerabilities exposed during those 48 hours were not unique, they could happen again if ignored. This internal view of Indigo showed the other side of the meltdown, the part passengers never saw. Part 6. Timeline of the 48-hour meltdown. The meltdown didn't happen all at once. It unfolded like a chain reaction, hour by hour. The first flights to feel the impact were early morning departures from Delhi and Mumbai. At 5:30 a.m., the first wave of cancellations was announced. A handful of flights delayed by crew shortages. Passengers waited, thinking it was temporary. But the ripple effect had already started. By mid-morning, cancellations spread to Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and Chennai. Flights scheduled for connecting passengers were delayed, and soon airports began reporting packed terminals. Families, business travelers, and students were stuck, some trying to make alternative arrangements while others sat helplessly. By 10 a.m., more than 50 flights had been cancelled. Social media began buzzing with passenger complaints, and videos of overcrowded airports started trending online. Afternoon brought the real escalation. Crew shortages forced Indigo to cancel flights sequentially. A delay in Delhi meant flights out of Mumbai had no crew available. Flights scheduled for evening departures were affected because planes and crew could not align. Screens across airports turned red, cancelled, and the number climbed rapidly. By 3 p.m., nearly 150 flights had been grounded. As evening approached, the crisis spread nationwide. Airports became congested. Passengers slept on floors, waiting for updates. Hotels in nearby cities reported last-minute bookings as travelers scrambled to find alternatives. Airlines scrambled to reassign crew, but regulatory limits on duty hours made it nearly impossible to cover all flights. Each cancellation created a domino effect, touching cities hundreds of miles away. By nightfall, social media was flooded with real-time updates. Some flights rescheduled, others cancelled. DGCA officials were monitoring operations closely. Emergency teams were deployed to manage passenger assistance. Airlines tried to stabilize operations, but the chain reaction was relentless. By the end of day 1, over 200 flights had been cancelled. Day 2 started with renewed chaos. Early morning flights were delayed as crew returned, but the backlog remained. Passengers arriving at airports were greeted with cancellations or significant delays. Airports had to manage thousands of stranded travelers. Airlines struggled to assign staff while maintaining compliance with duty rules. Even small delays at one airport caused ripple effects across the country. Throughout the 48 hours, hotspots emerged. Delhi, Mumbai, and Bengaluru were most affected due to their high traffic volume. Hyderabad and Chennai faced secondary congestion as flights were diverted. Smaller airports felt the indirect impact, receiving delayed aircraft and passengers from major hubs. By the end of day 2, the total cancellations reached approximately 300 flights, affecting tens of thousands of passengers. This timeline highlights one crucial lesson. Aviation is a tightly connected system. One failure can trigger a cascade of operational problems. Crew shortages, strict duty hours, and high flight density created a perfect storm, and once the chain reaction began, it was extremely difficult to stop. Part 7. Could this have been avoided? Voiceover script. 1,000 words. Experts analyzing the crisis said yes, in theory, this could have been avoided. But avoiding it would have required foresight, planning, and human-centric management. One key factor was staffing. Airlines operating at near full capacity need buffer crew to cover unexpected absences. Indigo's buffer was insufficient, and when a large number of employees reported sick, the system had no immediate solution. Communication was another critical failure. Passengers often received delayed or conflicting information. Real-time updates could have mitigated frustration. Clear communication about alternative flights, rebooking, and compensation policies might have reduced chaos at airports. But without a proactive communication strategy, the airline struggled to manage expectations. Experts also pointed to scheduling practices. High-density flight schedules, back-to-back duties, and minimal rest periods created vulnerability. When employees are overworked, fatigue increases, and so does the risk of absenteeism. A better balance between operational efficiency and staff well-being could have prevented the mass disruption. Technology and contingency planning were also tested. Airline software tracks crew availability, schedules, and flight connections, but no system can predict a sudden mass absence without manual intervention. Emergency protocols and backup plans need to account for human factors, not just technical operations. In this case, the system failed to account for a worst-case scenario. Regulatory rules, while intended to improve safety, unintentionally added pressure. Staff had to comply with stricter duty limits, which meant less flexibility during a crisis. Rolling back the rules temporarily helped, but ideally, rules should be implemented with adequate transition periods and coordination with airlines to avoid such clashes. In short, the crisis was avoidable, but only if airlines, regulators, and employees had systems and policies that balanced efficiency, human factors, and communication. It was a harsh reminder that operational excellence isn't just about numbers, it's about people, planning, and proactive foresight. Part 8. How Indigo recovered, and what happens next. Once DGCA stepped in and temporary rule rollbacks were applied, Indigo began stabilizing operations. Crew members returned gradually, flights were rescheduled, and terminals slowly cleared of frustrated passengers. The airline deployed emergency task forces to coordinate staff, monitor compliance, and manage airport operations. Flights resumed sequentially, first short domestic routes, then connecting flights, then major hubs. Customer care teams worked overtime to assist stranded passengers, arrange rebooking, and provide compensation where applicable. Airports slowly regained control. Screens changed from cancelled to delayed, signaling progress. But the backlog of passengers and flights took days to fully clear. Indigo's leadership acknowledged the internal failures. They promised to review scheduling, staffing, and communication protocols. Lessons learned would be used to redesign operations for better resilience. This included creating buffer crew rosters for emergencies, improving real-time passenger communication, enhancing contingency planning, balancing operational efficiency with employee well-being. The DGCA continued monitoring the airline. Investigations focused on why mass absenteeism occurred and how to prevent it in the future. Regulatory oversight increased temporarily, with emphasis on crew management, duty compliance, and contingency protocols. Penalties were considered, but balanced with acknowledgement of safety compliance. For passengers, the recovery meant delays were reduced, and rebookings made travel possible again. But the event left a lasting impression. Travelers became more aware of airline vulnerabilities, and public discussion on crew treatment and operational planning gained prominence. Indigo itself faced a crossroads: learn and adapt, or risk a repeat. The airline's recovery showed resilience, but the meltdown exposed the cracks. And these cracks needed long-term solutions, not temporary fixes. Part 9. What this means for India's aviation future. The Indigo meltdown is more than a single airline crisis. It's a lesson for the entire aviation industry in India. Millions of passengers rely on airlines every day. Any disruption has cascading effects, from personal travel plans to business operations, from medical emergencies to international connections. The crisis highlighted the importance of employee well-being. Crew fatigue and overwork are not minor issues. They can disrupt operations on a massive scale. Airlines must design schedules that consider human limits. Regulators must balance safety rules with operational feasibility. Passengers must understand that safety cannot be compromised, even when it is inconvenient. It also showed the importance of contingency planning. Backup crew, flexible scheduling, emergency communication, and proactive passenger assistance are not optional. They are essential. Without these measures, even the most efficient airline can collapse under pressure. The DGCA's response sets a precedent. Temporary rule adjustments, strict monitoring, and accountability ensure that airlines cannot ignore systemic problems. Other airlines will likely review their operations, learning from Indigo's challenges. Safety, operational resilience, and communication are now more critical than ever. For passengers, the event was a reminder that even large, reputable airlines are vulnerable. Travel plans can be disrupted by factors beyond weather or technical issues. Awareness, patience, and contingency thinking have become part of modern travel. Finally, for the aviation industry, the Indigo meltdown is a wake-up call. India's airlines are growing rapidly. Passenger numbers are increasing. Airports are becoming busier. But growth cannot outpace planning, human resource management, and safety measures. The future of aviation depends on learning from crisis, adapting to challenges, and designing systems that are not just efficient, but resilient. This meltdown was painful, chaotic, and frustrating, but it also taught valuable lessons for airlines, regulators, passengers, and the entire aviation ecosystem. The event will be studied, analyzed, and remembered. And if the lessons are applied, it could make India's aviation system stronger, safer, and more reliable in the years to come. Conclusion. The big lesson. The Indigo meltdown was more than cancelled flights. It was a story about people, pressure, and systems pushed to their limits. For passengers, it was chaos, delays, missed plans, long hours in crowded airports. For employees, it was exhaustion, long shifts, strict rules, and sudden responsibility to keep the airline running. For the airline and regulators, it was a test of planning, communication, and leadership. What this crisis truly showed is simple. Even the largest and most successful systems can fail if human factors are ignored. Technology, schedules, and rules can only go so far. At the center of every flight are people, passengers waiting, pilots and crew working, staff managing operations. When they are overworked, under pressure, or unheard, disruption becomes inevitable. And yet, there is hope. Indigo's recovery, the DGCA's intervention, and the lessons learned remind us that mistakes can lead to change. Systems can improve. Communication can be better. Employees can be supported. And passengers can be protected. Every crisis, no matter how chaotic, carries a lesson, if we are willing to learn. For India's aviation industry, this meltdown is a turning point. It is a wake-up call for airlines to prioritize human well-being, operational resilience, and contingency planning. It is a signal for regulators to balance safety rules with practical implementation. And it is a reminder for passengers to stay aware, patient, and prepared. For all of us, the story carries a broader message. Life, work, and systems everywhere face pressure, challenges, and unexpected disruptions. How we respond defines the outcome. When things go wrong, we learn, adapt, and grow. Planning matters. Communication matters. Caring for people matters. And small steps to prepare for challenges can prevent disasters in the future. So next time you see chaos, whether in airports, offices, or everyday life, remember the Indigo Meltdown. Remember the lessons. Balance efficiency with humanity, plan for emergencies, and always put people first. Because systems fail less when humans are considered, prepared, and respected. The 48-hour chaos may have ended, flights resumed, and passengers reached their destinations. But the story leaves a lasting mark, a reminder that even in disruption, there is insight. Even in frustration, there is learning. And even in crisis, there is opportunity to improve. The Indigo Meltdown was painful, but it was also powerful, a lesson in resilience, planning, and human responsibility. And if India's aviation industry, and all of us, take these lessons seriously, the skies will become safer, smoother, and more reliable for everyone. Because at the end of the day, understanding the story is not just about flights or airlines. It is about people, planning, and the power to learn from mistakes. And that is the big lesson.